Alright, hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Kyle. I am going to talk in this video about the books that I read in February, which was not very many. Really, I finished 2 books in February. I finished one audiobook just a couple days ago at the beginning of March, so I'm going to talk about that too. And then I have a bunch of other stuff that's kind of like in flight still, in progress. But yeah, let's get into it. The first book that I finished in February was The Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald. I absolutely love this book. This is like unlike anything I've ever read before, really. The back of it says that it's fiction. I think it may use the word novel somewhere. I don't know. I definitely wouldn't call this a novel. It's this very like, it kind of defies all genre categories. It's like a biography kind of, and like a memoir, like a travelogue, but it's also like it's not an essay collection, but it definitely borrows heavily from the essay as a form. Yeah, it's really interesting. So what this book is about, the book begins with the narrator in a hospital, and he's thinking back on the prior summer where he had finished a large body of work, some large project he'd been working on. And to like clear his head after that, he decides to go on a walk around Suffolk County in England. And so the book is kind of him reflecting on this journey that he took the prior summer. And a lot of it is he'll be describing his walks that he took. So he's walking around. He'll be describing the things that he's seeing on his walks. But then he'll take those images as a jumping off point to digress into other things that it makes him think of. So like, for example, at one point he's walking along this river and there's this small footbridge that crosses the river, and he's writing about how this bridge was originally for a single gauge railroad, and there was a car on that railroad that was emblazoned with the crest of the Chinese emperor. And it was rumored that this train car was originally made for the Chinese emperor, and somehow it ended up in this small town in England. And then it very quickly moves to talking about the Opium Wars in the 19th century and about the British involvement in the Taiping Rebellion, and how the British upheld the monarchy, the emperor, the Chinese emperor after that, and about the Empress Dowager in China and how her struggles for power, and how she cloistered her nephew, who was the heir apparent, and kind of like locked him away in this secret palace and didn't let anyone go near him, and probably poisoned him to death too. So it's kind of, and this is it kind of like has these jumping off points like that throughout the whole book. That's basically what it is. And it's really interesting, those movements from talking about what he's seeing in England to these other topics, kind of, they can happen within a single sentence, and they do happen within single sentences, and the sentences are long. I mean, you can see, like, this is a good example. The pages, basically, there are very few paragraph breaks. Most of these are, I wouldn't say most of them, but a lot of you'll find sentences that'll go on for a page or two. Most of the sentences are long, and so you'll have, in one sentence, he'll be looking at a train car. I don't know if that section of it actually was in one sentence or not, but he does this kind of movement often, where in a single sentence he's looking at something, and then by the end of the sentence he's talking about something completely different that he's digressed from, with all these like just compounding and adding clauses on top of clauses on top of clauses to these sentences. And that really adds to the themes of the book, which are a lot about like the movement of time and the connection between the past and the present, and how the present doesn't exist in this bubble, but it's always like overdetermined by the past. And just the ways in which nothing is truly isolated ever, but everything is kind of like connected together in some way. Everything is a product of material history. Yeah, it's a really, really fascinating book. I finished it and I almost wanted to just immediately pick it up and start reading it again. But I have other things that I need to read as well, so I did not do that. But yeah, I did buy a copy of The Emigrants, also his book prior to this one, I think. And that came in the mail a couple weeks ago, so I'm going to read that eventually. But yeah, Rings of Saturn was very, very good. When I didn't talk about too, the other thing that this talks about a lot is about the sort of lasting effects of European colonialism is a big like ghost that's haunting this book. But yeah, very good. The next book that I finished, and I just finished this probably, I don't know, maybe like last weekend or sometime in the past week, is Randall Jarrell's Book of Stories. So this is a story anthology. Randall Jarrell is a pretty, well, he was a famous poet. There's an episode of the Backlisted podcast about him. He was like the equivalent of the Poet Laureate of the United States at one point, but this was before Poet Laureate was a thing. It was like a different term. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, he was a pretty famous poet. He wrote children's books as well that were really popular, and he was also like a literary critic. So this is a story anthology that he assembled. It was originally published in 1958. This is NYRB republished it in the early 2000s. And basically what this is, there's 30 stories in here that they're all sort of like, there's an anthology of stories called The Weird that I bought last year. And I was I was a little disappointed in The Weird. I think that this is really more what I was looking for. So the stories in here are all kind of like primordial, and like all of the signifiers are overdetermined, and they're like dreamlike, and it's like the unconscious put to text, and it like there's something very ambiguous and open-ended about all of the stories that he's collected here. And primordial, I feel like that's a word that really captures like the essence of these stories that are in here. So Jarrell himself has a good introduction to this, in which he's talking about how like the fundamental impulse of storytelling, behind storytelling, is dreams and hopes and wishes and desires, fantasy. It's the unconscious, really, is like emerging through, and it comes through in stories. And so you get this tension in stories between desire and fantasy and hope, and these things emerging from the imagination, byproducts of our unconscious, and the tension between those things and the material facts of the world. The other big thing that he talks about is this idea in his introduction. Well, it's not even a big thing. Another thing that he talks about in his introduction is this these like two polarities of stories, two extremes. On one end, you have stories in which everything is a happening. And these are stories in which every single detail in the story is just overloaded with significance, and every single detail in the story carries so much meaning. And the story is just the accumulation of all of these overdetermined signifiers. And then, on the other hand, you have these stories in which nothing happens. And in these stories, like, even the climax of the story is just another event in its continuum, and it's like the actual flow of the narrative itself is kind of the thing. Like there is no, the events don't have real meaning, and so that's sort of like a spectrum upon which stories can fall. So anyway, his introduction was good, kind of weird, kind of like Freudian. It definitely feels like something that came out of the 50s, but it's an interesting introduction. The stories themselves, it collects 30 stories. They're actually not all stories either, I should say that. He, in his introduction, he talks a little about how like he's trying to get at the like essence of storytelling with the things that he's collected here. And so you have short stories, but you also have like fairy tales, stuff from the Brothers Grimm and from Hans Christian Andersen, and you have stuff from the Old Testament. You have poetry in here. There's a couple narrative poems. There's an excerpt from Rilke's notebook of, I forget what it is. It's like his fictional journal that he wrote. There's a letter from Tolstoy that's absolutely insane, that he sends it to his sister-in-law, and it's a letter in which he tells his sister-in-law that his wife, so her sister, has like been transfigured into a porcelain doll that's tiny and can break and is fragile, and like he goes on for pages talking about how his wife is now a doll. That was one of the best things in this. I really loved that letter. But anyway, and there's like some folk tales in here. There's some excerpts from Chuang Tzu. It's got, let's see, I'll read out all of the authors who are in this. You have Kafka, Chekhov, Rilke, Robert Frost, Giovanni Verga, Nikolai Gogol, Elizabeth Bowen, Ludwig Tieck, I don't know how you pronounce that name, Bertolt Brecht, Leo Tolstoy, Peter Taylor, Hans Christian Andersen, Catherine Ann Porter, the Brothers Grimm, E.M. Forster, the Book of Jonah, Franz Kafka. I already said there's a couple Kafka stories in here. Saint-Simon, Isaac Babel, Chuang Tzu, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, William Blake, D.H. Lawrence, Turgenev, Wordsworth, Frank O'Connor, Isaac Dinesen. Yeah, it was a great collection. My favorite stories that I read from here was The Nose by Nikolai Gogol, which I'd never read. I've heard of The Nose before, but I never read it, and that story was really, really good. I highly recommend it. What else did I like from here a lot? Rothschild's Fiddle by Chekhov was really, really good. Samson and Delilah by D.H. Lawrence. The Porcelain Doll Letter from Tolstoy that I already talked about a little bit. Frank O'Connor's Peasants, Isaac Dinesen's Sorrow Acre. All of the stories were really good. The other thing, too, is that, so, I mean, you just heard out all of the authors I've listed. They're well, I wouldn't say they're all. Most of them are pretty famous and well-regarded authors. But he hasn't collected, except for The Nose, which is I know is a pretty well-known story. But I think most of these other stories in here aren't the things where you would expect. Like, he doesn't have In the Penal Colony for Kafka, for example. He has A Country Doctor, and what's the other Kafka story? The Bucket Rider, which I'd never read. The Bucket Rider. That one was a pretty crazy story too. Yeah. That's Randall Jarrell's Book of Stories. I don't know what else to say about it. It's a really good anthology. I recommend it. Let's see. The only other thing that I finished... Well, actually, those are the only things I finished in February. I did finish a couple days ago on the 1st of March, I think, or maybe the 2nd. I finished Poguemahone by Patrick McCabe. I listened to the audiobook of it, which is narrated by Patrick McCabe himself. His narration is actually absolutely brilliant. His reading of it, I mean. it's kind of, I don't really know how to talk about it without spoilers, because it's a book that relies heavily on plot twists, and there's an unreliable narrator. So it's kind of difficult even to talk about like the structure of the book. I feel like would be giving things away. So I don't really want to talk about that. I will say that for the audiobook, his McCabe's narration is great. It's really like unhinged, and it's almost like some drunk Irish guy at a bar who like takes a shining to you and just decides that he wants to like grab your arm and tell you his whole life story over the course of 17 hours or however long the audiobook was. So it's really like it's his narration is just wild. It's he does an absolutely brilliant job reading the work. On a sentence level, it's really, really well written. The characters have such the narratorial voice is just brilliant. I don't know how else to say things without really giving things away. It's good. One thing I would say is that I got this book thinking that it was going to be an exploration of like living with and having a relationship with someone with dementia, and that is not at all what this is. So I wouldn't go into this book. If that's what you're looking for, don't go to this book. But that said, it's really good. The other thing that I would say is that the last few hours of the book, like the last 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, absolutely flew by for me. And I was like really, really eager to finish it at that point. But the first like 14 hours or however many before that, I think I want to say it was 17 hours long for some reason, but I don't know if that's actually right. It is pretty long though. But the first bit of it is kind of feels like a slog sometimes on the audiobook. Even though the narration is so charismatic and so has such a strong personality, that's really what's carrying it. Because aside from that, it's very there's stuff about the structure of it that I don't want to talk about without giving things away that kind of lends itself to it just kind of feels like it goes on for a bit too long, especially on the audiobook because there's an unreliable narrator, because of certain ways that the book is structured. I felt a lot of the times like I was missing something and I wanted to go back and reread some bits, and that's very difficult on an audiobook. So I liked this book a lot, and I really, really liked Patrick McCabe's reading of the audiobook. But I do think I would have been better served having a physical copy as well to like go back and reread some bits. But yeah, that would be my only reservation with it. Aside from that, I thought this was a really, really good book. Yeah, I recommend it. Let me talk about the things that I'm currently reading. So I have a few things that are currently in flight as well. Let me talk about the audiobook I'm listening to first of all. So I did last weekend, I had to go, or actually the weekend before last weekend, I had to drive for like 7 hours. And I'd been listening to Poguemahone, but I knew that I didn't want to listen to 7 hours of Poguemahone in the car, because it's a lot. And it also, that's another thing about the audiobook of Poguemahone is that usually I listen to audiobooks while I'm like cooking dinner or walking the dog or driving or something. And I found Poguemahone kind of difficult to do that with. Like, it requires some focus to listen to it, and it's again because of some of the ways that it's structured. But anyway, I didn't want to listen to that on the drive down, so I got another audiobook on Audible to listen to my drive, and I got what is the name of it? It's the Sally Rooney book, Beautiful World, Where Are You? By Sally Rooney. And I've been liking it a lot. I mean, I'm going to talk about it. I'll talk about it in my next month's wrap up because I still have like 3 hours left on it. Let's see. The other stuff I'm reading, I've been reading My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I started this last weekend and I'm almost done with it. I have 1 chapter left. Well, I think there's 2 chapters left, but the last chapter is like a page long. Yeah, I'm liking this as well. I will talk about it next month. And let's see, I've also been reading these 2 books in French. I've been reading this Selected Poems of Paul Verlaine, which this edition has like French on one page and an English translation on the facing page. I've been reading the French versions. I studied French from middle school through grad school, really, but I haven't read anything in French in like since leaving grad school, which was like 10 years ago at this point almost. So one of my goals for this year was to start reading things in French again. So that's what I'm doing with these. Oh, and the other one is Je ne suis pas sorti de ma nuit. I can't speak French very well, but I can read it. I can read it okay. Yeah, by Annie Ernaux. In this, I've just read the like little introductory part of it. Yeah, I haven't gotten to her diaries, and I can tell that this is going to be a very difficult book, like emotionally, to get through. But yeah, this seems like it's going to be really good. So yeah, that's the stuff I've been reading. Let me know what you've been reading in the comments below. Let me know if you have any recommendations, what you think about these books, if you think anything about them. And yeah, I will see you next month, or maybe sooner if I decide to make an earlier video. Probably not.